to the end. How do you feel? Oh my God. Unexpected energy. Unexpected energy. And a very appropriate seminar for the end, since it won't take a lot of thinking and there's a lot of fun in it. Great hoaxes in cocktail history. My companion here, David Wondrich, is going to be helping me. He's going to be covering a lot of the 19th century hoaxes and some 20s, and I'll be doing mainly post-Prohibition. Before we start, I wanted to say a little bit about the sponsorship of this particular seminar. There is no sponsorship. You'll notice that most of the seminars at Tales are sponsored by liquor companies, which makes sense and probably is as it should be because the money that they provide makes a lot of this engine go. But it's lesser known that when Tales accepts a seminar topic, thinking it's worthy of inclusion, they do it no matter what, no matter whether it gets a liquor sponsor or not. And these things aren't cheap. I mean, between the rental of the room and all the other expenses, they cost about $5,000 to put on. And when there's no sponsorship, they barely break even. So I think we should give Tales a round of applause for actually doing this.
Wait. So you're saying sponsors didn't want to be associated with great hoaxes?
Yeah, go figure. Go figure. I didn't put those two and two together. That makes sense. Yeah, great hoaxes. Let's go with that one. Yeah. Okay, so cocktail journalists and historians such as David and me, we do a lot of grousing about the lack of transparency and the stories behind cocktails and spirits. There's a lot of tall tales and yarns and outright lies. But the flip side of that same coin is that some of these stories and tall tales and hoaxes actually lend to the kind of rich tapestry of the tale of the barroom as it goes over the decades and the centuries. And there's a way of thinking that it really belongs there. Tomfoolery and jokes and big fish tales, you know, you should get them in the bar and behind some of these cocktails. I'm going to hand it over to David here, who's going to kick us off, and I will see you midway.
All right. If we could have the...
I didn't know I did that.
Oh, my God.
Or that.
All right.
I was experimenting, and some of it stayed.
So that...
I mean, you thought that was the drinking, right?
That was interesting. That's a hell of a thing to spring on drunk people. I couldn't focus at all. So as an ex-academic, I'm going to start maybe a little before the age of the cocktail. Forgery is as old as writing, practically. Somebody gets to writing something, and then the next day somebody is using that document as proof of something. The third day somebody else has a document that's just as old as the first one that says something different. I mean, it goes back, and that one was, of course, made that night. And it goes back into antiquity. There's a long and intense discourse about forgery and the Bible, and many attempts to throw out the forged books, and apocryphal as they're called. That's a polite word for forged. For instance, there was the Gospel of Jesus and Magdalene, where Jesus marries Mary Magdalene, and they set up housekeeping and have children. And that was excised from the Bible eventually. But it was that kind of thing floating around there. Anybody who had, a splinter group would forge their own gospel that they claimed was as authentic as the gospel of Luke or John or whatever. And so it goes way back. The greatest historical forgery was this document called the Donation of Constantine, in which the Emperor Constantine of the Roman Empire, who was in the 4th century, he was a pagan, and he converts to Christianity after trying praying to help him out with some health issues. And next thing you know, he's drawing up this huge legal document giving the Roman Empire to the church. All of it. That's a pretty good gift. I mean...
I wouldn't re-gift that one.
No. And the church, we first hear of this donation, not in the 4th century when it was supposedly written, but in 778 when Pope Hadrian is writing to Emperor Charlemagne, who had the Holy Roman Empire, reminding him that actually we own all your stuff. We the church. So somebody cooked this up, and there were a few people who were suspicious, but it's really not until the 1400s that it gets debunked and somebody does the heavy lifting. And these techniques are still useful today in detecting forgery. Lorenzo Valla, one of the humanist scholars of the Renaissance, who went back to greater level of detail and rigor, academic rigor in language study and all this revival of classicism. He studied the language of this thing and found that there were words that could not have been used in the 400. They were concepts that had not existed. And he goes through and he checks the chronology of everything and finds that the dates are wrong here and there, and so on and so forth, and proves conclusively that the document was a forgery. Classically, there's certain motives for forgery. The donation of Constantine, obviously, is for gain of money, power, and legitimacy. Those are the things you're usually trying to get if you forge a document for gain. There's also forgery for amusement, where you're coming up with something fake that amuses the hell out of you, and maybe you put some clues in it so that it'll amuse a select few friends and go over everybody else's head. If we could have the next slide, please. For instance, the secret history of the cocktail here, which appeared in the Baltimore Sun in 1908. And you've got the old engravings, you've got the rare documents, etc. This begins the cocktail, said an intellectual Baltimore Street bartender. Baltimore Street was the main street of bars in Baltimore. The cocktail, says this bartender, is a distinctly American invention. True enough, the name originated in England and was there applied to mixtures as early as the time of Dr. Johnson. But the true cocktail, as every patriotic American knows it today, was invented in the state of Maryland on April 17th, 1846. And it goes on from there. We're going to get a little more into that in a minute. But you could already see some of the little tone of amusement here, the bold statement, the exact dates, and all this stuff. So that's, in our world, this is one of the more powerful uses for or specimens or types of forgery we run across. There's another one, if you wouldn't mind.
Wait, did you want that?
Yes, this is perfect. This is the Squire's Recipes. This is where forgery sort of occurs inadvertently or by accident. You're playing around and somebody takes something seriously. This guy, Kendall Banning, wrote a book and set it in type. He puts on this title page, 1784, does it for his friends. He wrote it in 1912. He puts in a list of drinks, and all in fake 18th century language. He aged the paper in the oven that it was printed on, so it looked old. But it was all a private joke for him and his friends, and they all knew that it was fake. And it was just him playing around. Let's be 18th century here, and it kind of got into the wild. And suddenly people were referring to it in newspapers as an authentic source on the history of cocktails. And it's not, because it has ingredients applying our Lorenzo Valla hat, putting that on. I don't know. I don't think he wore a hat like this, but he wore some kind of hat. You go through the ingredients, and there's Old Tom gin in there, not a factor until at least 1810. Sweet vermouth, unknown in England. Tartaric acid. in the ingredients for the drinks, various kinds of syrup, grenadine. No. So he wasn't taking it that seriously. It was just his favorite drinks done up in an 18th century style as a joke for his friends. And then it gets out, so he does, this is from the second edition, where he puts a forward saying it's all fake, and, but we're having fun. And he manages to tamp that down. If I could have the next slide. Another case is Stirred, Not Shaken by John Docksat. John Docksat was the leading English drinks journalist of the 60s and 70s and into the 80s. He was not known for his academic rigor. He came up as a liquor salesman and worked for the Seeger and Evans Gin Company for a long time, and then for Booth's for a long time. But he was a very energetic writer, and he collected a lot of stories. He wrote a lot of books. And in this one, he tried something new. He wrote these imagined scenes where drinks were created. And he imagines the martini being created while Samuel Johnson, the guy who wrote the first English dictionary in the mid-1700s, and his biographer James Boswell are standing around, and they're drinking white Rhine wine mixed with gin, and that's the first dry martini. But he says at the beginning of the book that these are all imagined. What appears in newspapers? Suddenly, Samuel Johnson invented the martini. So but things do escape into the wild that are maybe not meant to be taken so seriously. And sometimes the forgery is created in the mind of the reader. I wanted to talk a little bit about detection of forgery and forgery in general. Forgeries tend to occur when somebody perceives a vacuum. Somebody sees, like, there's a hole here, and there's nothing here to fill it. Maybe if I can slip something in there, if you're doing it for gain, that people will trust. So to do that, you have to pander to that need. So forgeries tend to answer very specific questions, like, what is the history of the cocktail? We don't know. An effective forgery doesn't say, well, we really don't know, but it had to be before this because this and this. An effective forgery has a date because people want a firm answer, and that's what the forger is doing. Like people in the 1970s, they were looking back on the legacy of World War II, and the monstrous figure of Adolf Hitler was on everyone's minds, like what drove him, what made him want to do this. And suddenly this guy, Konrad Kujow, finds, I don't know how many, 17, 18 volumes of Hitler's personal diaries in a garage in Germany. And and it looks it's got a lot of detail. It answers everybody's questions as to what was in Hitler's mind, but of course it was completely forged. It took a while to detect that. So there's always something like, that's always a part of it, is they're more focused than genuine documents because they're answering a specific question. It's not created, and that specific question is not from the time when they're supposedly written or supposedly created. The specific question is at another time. They rarely surprise. That's not the point of one of these things. The point is to confirm something, to build trust. And you don't want something controversial as a forgery. It's got to seem real and solid. The sourcing is always slippery. It's either unnamed or it's a book I have in my possession or a personal communication, an audio tape that somebody gave me, certain videotapes, etc. It goes on. So there's always that kind of thing. In the cocktail world, hoaxes and fake news, to use the modern term, go pretty far back. At first, they're fairly simple. There's no point in giving slides for this stuff because these are just newspaper articles, and you can imagine what a newspaper article looks like. For instance, in 1845, the sherry cobbler is a new drink in London, and somebody's wondering about that, where it comes from, and says, and he can't find any origin story for it, and so he says forthrightly, "Let us therefore devise a fable to account for the origin of the sherry cobbler and its importation into our beloved country of England." And he has this complicated, long fable. So he's like honest about it. We don't know. I'm going to make something up. Okay, that's step one. It gets further down. We move ahead to 1891, and a New York Bartenders Association, the Liberal Brotherhood, had a house magazine. And I haven't been able to find the magazine, but somebody excerpted an article from it on the origin of the cocktail, saying, and it's this very detailed, suspiciously detailed article, complete with quoted dialogue from things that happened many years before, saying it happened, the cocktail was invented in Culpeper Courthouse, Virginia, by a certain Colonel Carter, who was disgusted at the liquor dealers' mixing of horrible stuff in the tailings of various barrels to make mixed drinks, and he dashed out the drink and says, "Henceforth, I will make cocktails of my own devising," and promptly puts vermouth in it. And this is supposedly from the early part of the 19th century, so they didn't have vermouth in America, so that's out. The thing is completely forged. I don't know originally if it was presented as a fable or if it was presented as true, but this gets a lot of traction. It gets reprinted all around, and everybody's talking about this article. And when somebody mentions that a different origin for the cocktail, there's always people writing into the newspapers talking about Colonel Carter in Culpeper Courthouse, Virginia. And so it answered a very important need. Is the cocktail had to come from my state, not your state. So it had to come from the South, not the North, or from the North, not the South. And so these forgeries are always, they're always very, very secure and state very forthrightly exactly where this happened, because forgery is against ambiguity. It's got to seem like more solid than solid. In 1905, the Chicago Sunday Tribune publishes an article called "Drinks of the World, Many and Weird," right? And it begins by saying, Emile Necker, quote, mixologist, for 32 years the most famous bartender in New Orleans, has compiled a book in which he sets forth the drinks of the world. Necker has listed 843 American drinks, or naturalized drinks, that are worthy of a place in his book, where he has an array of 11,754 mixed and straight drinks that, so far as he can find out, have never been served in the United States. And then it goes on to quote all these weird drinks from all around the world, some of which actually do check out, but of course there was no Emile Necker in New Orleans. This is completely made up, but the amount of detail is so overpowering. It gets reprinted and reprinted and reprinted, and nobody stops to think, 11,000 drinks? How big is this book? I mean, it goes on. It's got like paragraphs like, "The Dutch," declares the booze historian, "are perhaps the most unhealthful drinkers in the world. They drink huge quantities of rum and gin, and this on top of a diet of smoked eels, hard-boiled eggs, and pickled cucumbers with much smoking is not conducive to good digestion." And and there's all this, and it goes from the Dutch on to like the drunkest people on earth. The best drink ever is from wild honey from the heart of desert Australia, mixed with some other goddamn thing, and it goes on and on. But it's weird that this appears in the Chicago Tribune, because I suspect very strongly the culprit was H.L. Mencken, who wrote for the Baltimore Sun, but he also freelanced, and this was the Sunday Tribune, and people freelanced for the Sunday magazine sections then as now. And Mencken had penchant for writing hoaxes. You know, he was the greatest American political journalist of the first half of the 20th century. He was the greatest commentator on the American language. His book on the American language in 3 huge fat volumes and several editions is pretty much unparalleled. His reminiscences of his newspaper days, his autobiography is unbelievable. And I mean, unbelievable in a good way. It's just... his hoaxes, however, were unbelievable in the other way. But he was a titanic figure in America, one of the important American public intellectuals. But he also had a very heavy Germanic sense of humor that he loved to indulge. And he wrote these hoaxes, including the Great Bathtub Hoax, which said that the first bathtub in the White House, and he gave the date and all this information about it. And it was completely made up. And he loved drinking, and he did several of these things as far as we can tell. This 1905 one is in the wrong paper, but the 1908 one that we had the picture of earlier with all the engravings and the intellectual Baltimore Street bartender, it goes on in great detail about the history of cocktails and so on and so forth. And then he does it again in 1909. He starts another one of these things. These are always unsigned, by saying, in the United States, said an intellectual Baltimore Street bartender, so that same guy who knew everything. The science of alcoholology bids fair to make enormous progress, despite the fact that it is a newcomer among us. However, there are 22 institutes devoted to it in Germany. At Halle, where I studied years ago, the Faculty of Alcoholology used to be headed by the distinguished professor Dr. Geheimrath Rudolf Knorz, author of Die Alkoholismus. His successor is Professor Hermann Bunce, a young man, but an able one. And then he says this study is needed in America because of such questions as, why does one man drink whiskey and another drink gin? Given a certain time and a certain diameter of esophagus, how much can a given man drink? Why is a cocktail called a cocktail? Did Edgar Allan Poe, the poet, not the barrister, invent the mint julep? These are some of the problems that demand solution. Here in America, the material is infinite. We are Catholic in our tastes and drink all sorts of stuff. We have no less than 6,242 separate and distinct brands of whiskey and no less than 3,464 brands of beer. I myself possess the secrets of 62 cocktails, 12 smashes, 18 flips, and 17 squashes. There are 17 different varieties of highball and 74 brands of brandied cherry. What a wealth of material for the student. And, you know, you can see that, you know, that 1905 article with the Emile Necker with his 11,000 something types of drink. There's kind of a common hand behind these, but this is all like, this is the kind of forgery that's done for private amusement. The casual reader, without much of a sense of humor, is going to go over this and it'll look okay because it's, you know, got lots of statistics and stuff. But somebody with a sense of humor and looking at, you know, Professor Dr. Geheimrath Rudolf Knorz is going to say, wait a minute, somebody's pulling my leg here. So he gives the game away without, you know, giving it away. And so it's the kind of forgery that, you know, can kind of, you could say all the clues to its solution are in there. But this thing gets reprinted a million times. And it's all over. The 1908 one where he introduced that intellectual Baltimore Street article, bartender, that is packed with authorities. Dr. Ferdinand Brown from Halle, Die Alkoholismus comes back, or is started off in that. Then there's a certain Maloney from Ireland, History of Drinking in Great Britain. These are, you know, the sources. There's the Smithsonian Institute that evidently penned a somewhat elaborate report on early drinking customs in the United States. There's the Diary of Herman Smith from 1832 to 1838, published by the Falstaff Society in 1884. Herman Smith was, according to this, the head bartender at various New York hotels and superintendent of the wine cellars at the famous Delmonico's. There's also Sir Edward McCubbin, the Scottish distiller, whose treatise on the cocktail was privately printed and very hard to find, according to this. the diligent student, looks at this stuff, and you start to laugh, but I went and I looked up all those authorities, and we can do that now. But in 1908, where the hell are you going to, you'd have to go to a library, and you'd have to go to a library that specialized on alcohol, and you'd have to look through their books, and if you didn't find these, that didn't mean they didn't exist. Of course they don't exist, none of them. Like Emile Necker, the famous New Orleans bartender, nope, not at all, not the most famous bartender in New Orleans, or not even an existing person. But this is the problem with drink history for the longest time, was there was no way to check. You'd get a thing of bullshit like this, and if you're particularly endowed with humor, you're going to laugh it off. But if you're the diligent type, you're going to go and look for those books, and you're going to have a real problem, because good luck finding them. And then you're going to run up against statements like, this is from one of those 2 articles of Mencken's from the Baltimore Sun. Meanwhile, you're probably recalling my statement, the intellectual Baltimore Street bartender says, that the modern cocktail was invented in 1846, and wondering how I will prove it. Attacking the subject in the scientific manner. That's always a giveaway, that somebody's up to pulling something. We find that it breaks up into definite questions, to wit, first, when was the cocktail invented? Second, by whom? Third, where? Fourth, who were present? Fifth, who drank the first cocktail? Sixth, who gave it its name? My answers to those questions are as follows. First, on the 17th of April, 1846 at 8:15 a.m. Second, by John Welby Henderson, the Who created it, a native of South Carolina. Third, where? At the Old Palo Alto Hotel in Bladensburg, Maryland. Fourth, who drank the first cocktail, or rather, who were present? Colonel Denmead Meglone, USA, United States Army, the Honorable George William Mattingly, member of Congress from Georgia, and Messrs. J. Upton Benson, Frederick G. Allison, and John A. Hopkins, besides the aforesaid Henderson. Who drank the first one? John A. Hopkins of Fairfax, Virginia. And finally, the sixth, and this is the master's touch here, who gave it its name? I don't know. So, obviously he knows the other ones. It's just that last detail. And so, I mean, this is very humorous drink forgery, but it's pretty masterful. You read through this thing, and he did an impressive job of capturing, sort of what drink writing was like, and capturing, the armature, the sort of the setup of scholarship, the smell of scholarship on here. Well, it's just obviously it's complete and total horseshit. But this was really very hard to excise from the history of drinks. That Culpeper Courthouse thing kept turning up. There are a few other hoaxes that we could go into. There's the one where somebody wrote an article that it was a Mexican princess. It was named after the Mexican princess Xochitl, X-O-C-I-T-L, and she was the goddess of drink, or named after the goddess of drink, and the cocktail was invented in Mexico, and so on and so forth. There's a lot of stuff like that, that journalists were having fun and trying to do this because they knew that there was no effective way to call them out. There was no effective way to disprove some of this stuff. Mencken telegraphing his punches here, but that Culpeper Courthouse one was a little more insidious, and that lasted for a long time. You found that Colonel Carter kept getting cited as the origin of the cocktail, and it goes on, and it really took until modern times and modern data processing and the internet, where you can break some of these myths because they become so deeply entrenched and they're so hard to disprove. But that said, I think we should talk about some case studies. What do you think?
Well, we're drinking a Tom Collins. Do you want to talk a little bit about the Tom Collins hoax before?
Absolutely. Okay. You walk into a bar, as some of us do, and the bartender leads over and says, "Hey, Jeff, Tom Collins was in here, and he was saying some pretty nasty things about you." And you're like, "Tom Collins? I don't know what Tom Collins." "Yeah, you better, he's going around town." "Is he here?" Bartender, "No, you know, say you're at Tujague's. He just went over to the Napoleon House. And you're like, back at the time, you know, a man's honor, you had to defend it. You didn't necessarily hire a lawyer. So you got to go over to the Napoleon House. And you go in, and the bartender there, Emile Necker, you ask him, you know, hey, Emile, you seen this Tom Collins guy? Is he in here? And Emile goes, oh, he wasn't here. You should have heard what he said about you. But I think he went over to the French 75 bar. And so you go to the French 75 bar, and there's Chris Hanna still there. And Chris, and you know, I'm looking for Tom Collins. And Chris is like, oh, he was just here. He said he was heading over to Tujague's, and you run around, you know, the bars of the cocktail route. And what made this work was every town had what was known as a cocktail route. There was a round of accepted saloons that you would go from one to the other, and you would see people just as one does during Tales of the Cocktail here. And then, you know, next thing you know, you're at the Alibi looking for Tom Collins, and then you're at the Mother-in-Law Lounge, and people just keep pushing it until you wise up. But this was very amusing in 1874.
This was all anyone was doing in 1874.
And there was a song written about it, and it gets written up in the papers. And this drink, the John Collins, named after John Collins, who was born in 1771, died in 1843. Not that's actual information as far as I can tell. That's not fake news. But John Collins was the head waiter and sort of bar steward at Limmer's Hotel in London, which was the sportiest, most violent gentleman's hotel in the world, where rich army officers went to get out insanely drunk on his gin punch and then fight duels and run out and pick fights with cab drivers and all the other stuff that gentlemen liked to do back then when they were in their cups. But so it was a legitimate drink, but in America, this Tom Collins thing is kind of, as the John Collins is getting popular, sort of infected, especially because the Tom Collins is made with Old Tom gin.
During that year, you would see these little mentions in newspapers like goings on about town. It says, Mr. Tom Collins was seen boarding the train to Chicago this morning, or Tom Collins was seen buying a new haberdashery on the main thoroughfare. It's like they were just having fun. They were bored reporters, just like me. All right, so I'm going to talk about stuff during post-Prohibition, and particularly post-World War II. We're in a different America than we were in the 19th century or the early 20th century, when newspapers could get away with printing rascally stories and barroom practical jokes could be sustained. Following World War II, the American marketing machine was in full swing, with Madison Avenue and an army of PR hucksters and shills waging all-out war on the newly leisure class of America to buy a lot of things that they really didn't need. Hence, many of the cocktail hoaxes, the one I'm going to talk about, perpetuated during these years, smacked of the corporate, like they were cooked up, you know, half in a boardroom and half in the back of a bar. And then they were farmed out to marketing field operators and done partly in collusion, it seemed to be, with the media, which in those days meant newspapers. And the newspapers were still staffed with lots of columnists, and the columnists were starved for copy, and they were always on the lookout for an unusual or amusing story. So first, I'm going to talk about the Pimm's Cup. I'm sure a lot of people in this room have had a Pimm's Cup this week. It's like the drink at the Napoleon House and many other bars around here. But back in the years after World War II, I mean, it was not a thing that was very well known in America. Beloved in England, but kind of obscure here. In June 1949, a man named Jim Moran, a wily New York marketing man prone to stunts, was enlisted for $500 American to raise the liqueur's profile in the United States. Moran was described by the journalist Maurice Zolotow as, quote, the last great bunco artist of the profession of publicity. That's Moran to the right. He's about to throw eggs into a moving fan.
I mean, why?
This is the kind of thing he came up with. And it almost always worked.
You should have brought a fan, Robert.
Yeah. What was I thinking? He made his mark. He first made his mark as a marketing genius when he was hired by General Electric, and he went to Alaska and he sold a refrigerator to an Eskimo. In 1944, he was hired by one of the people running for president to boost the campaign, and he actually went out to Nevada and changed horses in midstream, literally. Other stunts included walking a bull through a New York china shop, and he promoted a real estate development in New York by spending, I don't know what this has to do with it, by spending 10 days looking for a needle that he had dropped in a haystack. Real estate, I don't know. This is how Moran described his creative process. Quote, "How I work is I put myself into a state of trance. It is like yoga meditations. I tune everything out except the one problem. I hover between the conscious and the unconscious. My unconscious figures out these angles, not me." He seems to have done well for PIMS because he was still representing PIMS in 1970 and giving PIMS Cup parties at his townhouse. So, back to Mr. Moran. Here's one of the columns that initially reported on the stunt by Mel Heimer. The players in this stunt, there were four. There was Elvino Ray, an orchestra leader who worked at Billy Reed's club, and he was a musician of note at the time. He was also a good friend of Jim Moran. Jim Moran would sometimes flop on his couch, so he could just say, "Hey, Elvino, would you do this thing for me?" There was a musical theater actress named Nancy Andrews, a Broadway actor named Herbert Evers, and his companion, an actress named Ann Staunton, who was a bit player in the movies. They were all in their 20s, so probably game and needing money, save Ray, who is by far the most famous in the group, and as I said, a good friend of Moran. The incident went down at 2 a.m. Andrews walked in with Ray and ordered a PIMS Cup, probably rather loudly, but specified that there should be no cucumber. As garnish, she wanted mint. Shortly after, the other duo, Evers and Staunton, walked in, and they ordered PIMS Cups, and Staunton strenuously objected to the fact that Andrews had ordered hers with mint and said, "Everyone knows you order a PIMS Cup with a cucumber." And Andrews said, "No, it's with mint. I know the person who actually owns PIMS, and he has it with mint." And Staunton's reply was to smash a cucumber in Andrews' face. Or Ray's face. It depends on the account that you read. And then they kind of spilled out onto the sidewalk, and they kind of like threw hands at each other, and it was a cat fight. It all ended up at the 51st Street police station. The news made the front page of the World Telegram and then was picked up in other papers all over the world. Mel Heimer, I think he was probably in on the game because after he describes the incident in gory detail, he very dutifully explains to the public what PIMS is, where it's made, how long it's been around, how you use it, and stuff like that. Useful information for the reader. Moran bailed the four out. He arrived in disguise in a beard. He described himself to the police captain as a, quote, lecturer on abstract art and semantics. And the bail set was $500, exactly what he had been paid. So now we're going to talk about another drink. Now, in 1959, 2 years later, all kinds of panicky headlines were seen in the papers. Here are a few of them. Cabaret drinkers used to elephants see pink squirrel. Pink squirrel startles folks at club bar. Pink squirrel at bar grabs for nutbo. Pink squirrel startles partygoers at custom. And my favorite, shocking pink squirrel wreaks havoc at bars. Okay, so what the hell is going on? Obviously, some kind of mayhem. The pink squirrel in question in these stories was an actual pink squirrel, a squirrel painted pink. But the squirrel painted pink was in service of another pink squirrel, the cocktail that we all know. But they didn't really know it then. There's a picture of it, rather dainty pink squirrel, actually.
That's restrained.
Yeah, very restrained indeed. We know less about the story behind this, but it has many of the earmarks of the Pimm's story. The same elements. There was a pretty actress. There was a Manhattan club as the backdrop, and there was some outlandish behavior. I don't know who was hired to come up with this stunts. It's definitely certain it was someone hired by Bowles, or someone who worked for Bowles or Bowles America, because the two alcoholic ingredients it needed for a pink squirrel are both made by Bowles, or were back then. What happened is in June of 1951, again in the wee hours, this always seems to happen at 2 a.m., a singer named Betty Reed strolled into the El Barraco in Manhattan with an actual pink squirrel in tow. She took a stool, the varmint took another. They both ordered pink squirrels. This is a story. They drew attention. They got a little attention for this. Reed was more upfront. She admitted to reporters that she had been hired to publicize the drink. The duo, the woman and the squirrel, then made appearances at the Penthouse Club, Havana, Madrid, probably other places that evening. She said for the papers about pink squirrels, quote, "They look like strawberry sodas and taste fine." The article was again picked up by dozens of newspapers, and then if you track a couple years later, you find a lot of bars offering pink squirrels as a special. I'm going to throw it back to David now. He's going to talk a little bit about the Singapore sling.
Well, are you going to...
This picture came from David. There is Miss Betty Reed with
her pink squirrel.
In some of the articles, she was a lot more honest than other ones, talking about how the squirrel could be a little difficult.
Yeah.
They
caught her a couple times, like late in the day, when she'd been around to the bars drinking pink squirrels, and she was a little bit frank. It was very amusing. The Singapore sling is one of the most famous drinks. Singapore gin sling goes back to Singapore in the earliest definite reference we have is 1903 to a pink gin sling there, and there's a whole bunch of references from the 1910s and the 1920s, and it's a very popular drink in Singapore, but also in Malaysia, anywhere in British Asia. People are drinking a gin sling that's been made pink by the addition of either cherry brandy, Bowles are usually hearing, or sometimes sloe gin, or sometimes red wine. And it's always, there were a number of different recipes in circulation. And in the town of Singapore, the Raffles Hotel was, of course, known for it, but it wasn't actually the place that was best known for it. That was the bar at John Little's department store, which was a classic big British department store, and they were famous for their gin slings. Raffles was thought to have a pretty good one, but Raffles was a hotel and tourists could stay there. And as steamship and tourism develops in the 1920s, more and more tourists are arriving. This is something new. As if you had been at Jeff's and my seminar on Wednesday, we were talking about the development of tourism and how it really came in the 20th century more than anything. And so after World War I, you see a lot of it. And these tourists they might go to John Little's, but they're staying at the Raffles. So the Raffles suddenly, it takes over this drink slowly. And there are recipes and descriptions of the drink at the Raffles, pretty much an uninterrupted sequence well into the 1960s. And it's always the same drink. It's a very boozy drink. It's expensive to make. And the Raffles is really struggling. At the turn of the 1970s. It's got a new manager, this guy Roberto Pregars from Trieste, where my father was from, and he's a smart Italian, and he's trying to do a makeover. He makes over the bar, and he looks at the Singapore sling, and it needs something like the regular one, except It's got much less Benedictine, cherry brandy. The expensive stuff is way down. And suddenly it's got orange juice and pineapple juice in it. At first a little bit, but it just grows and grows and grows. And you know, what were people drinking in the 1970s? They were drinking things like our next drink with a lot of juice in it. And Prigars basically, as far as we can tell, remade the drink into a disco drink. And he fits it back on this guy. Later he admits, and this is from you first start hearing about Mr. Boone, or Mr. Nyam, I guess, in 1976, 1975. The legend of the original lost recipe that was never lost because they kept making Singapore slings all the way up until then. But anyway, you first hear that in 75, 76. Finally, in 1984, Roberto Prigars is being interviewed, and he tells the reporter for the Orange County Register that in California that while the drink always remained popular, it was Prigars, according to this interview with him, who improved it, keeping the same ingredients, but changing the shape of the glass and adding a few other touches to make it more exotic. And, you know, he basically more or less comes clean. Yeah, you know, the drink wasn't doing well, and so we had to modernize it. And so he modernized a classic British Empire drink into a 1970s disco drink, which it remains today, and at the raffles. And because now the other thing with forgery, once you rely on forgery, you're locked in. And it can be very difficult to admit about your career and what you did. So the raffles is all in on this is how we always made it, which is completely falsifiable.
Anyway, there's a lovely segue into another disco drink, the Harvey Wallbanger, which you all should have right now. This is another cocktail that increased in popularity due to a marketing scheme. This one is a bit more complex, mainly because the scheme was a lot more successful. And in order to talk about this, you have to talk about three men. One is a marketing man named George Bednar. One was an illustrator named Bill Young, and one was a bartender named Donato Antone. And between the three of them, they managed to whip up a national craze out of nothing in record time. First, we get George Bednar. Now, for the really dyed-in-the-wool cocktail geeks out there, this is probably the first picture of George Bednar that anyone has ever seen. I looked for a picture of George Bednar for the longest time, and I finally turned to his widow, and she mailed me this. It arrived yesterday. He's a businessman. Yes, he is indeed. George Bednar was a former football star who was hired around 1968 by McKesson, an importer. He was made vice president of the marketing division, and one of his main assignments was to improve the fortunes of Galliano, the Italian liqueur that McKesson handled in the United States. McKesson had good distribution for Galliano in the United States, but the bottles just sat there pretty much. It had good motivation to do better because not only did it own the importing rights, it actually owned the distillery in Livorno, Italy. So when you sold the bottle, they made a heavy profit. Bednar went out and did some research. He took a road trip. Back then, you couldn't just get on your computer and do some research. You really had to go out there. He went with Charlie Bertrand, the son of the president of McKesson, to find out who was drinking Galliano and why. He noticed that there was a heavy sales uptick around the area of Manhattan Beach in Los Angeles, California. There, he found everyone was drinking a cocktail called the Harvey Wallbanger, which is basically a screwdriver with a Galliano float on top. He had this eureka moment, and he knew immediately how to increase sales of Galliano. Now, I've been researching the Harvey Wallbanger for years now, for reasons still unclear to myself. And I always assumed until recently that McKesson came up with the name Harvey Wallbanger because it comes out of nowhere. The bartender who is associated with the creation of the drink. Donato Duke Antone, there he is, making some wall bangers or something with Galliano, is said by his grandson to have served the drink at his Los Angeles bar, the Black Watch, as the Duke Screwdriver from the 1950s on. The grandson said that some relatives remember dimly that the drink went under the name of Harvey Wallbanger in the 60s, early 60s, but there's no first-hand account of this, and all the relatives are deceased. So I kind of thought, you know, and there were no menus, absolutely no newspaper accounts of the Harvey Wallbanger until 1968, 69. So I sort of expected that the relatives had misremembered. They wanted credit for the Harvey Wallbanger, and so they said, "Oh yeah, Duke came up with that." And I thought McKesson just came up with the name. That's a better name than the Duke Screwdriver. Let's go with it. But I was wrong, because I recently spoke to David Bednar, George Bednar's son, and I had a long discussion with Anthony Wright, George Bednar's old business partner. And they both told me that when George Bednar went to California, the name Harvey Wallbanger was already there, was already on the drink. So they never found out who named the drink. So that's a mystery for now. Moreover, according to them, McKesson was not, this is another thing I believed, and they disproved. There was always this story around the Harvey Wallbanger that it was named after this California surfer who drank a bunch of them and liked them so much, or didn't like them so much, that he started like banging against the wall, banging his head or his fist or something. This is just a garbage story. But it just lasted for decades and decades, and that smacked of advertising. I thought that's McKesson too. But Bednar and Wright said George didn't come up with that. So there we go. However, Bednar was definitely responsible for the Wallbanger mania that followed. The Harvey Wallbanger craze is sort of like the Pimm's Cup and the Pink Squirrel thing on steroids. According to Tony Wright, the partner, Bednar, when he heard about the Harvey Wallbanger, he immediately got this picture in his brain of a character. He knew that, you know, there had to be a face to this crazy name. And so he hired an illustrator named Bill Young to come up with a kind of a caricature or a cartoon, somebody that looks like a guy named Harvey Wallbanger. Bill Young came up with, unfortunately, with this. And this was put on posters and beach towels and cups and T-shirts, everything that you can imagine. Yeah, there's Harvey. You couldn't escape him, and from 1970 on. McKesson was very aggressive in getting the Wallbanger off the ground. Wright told me that part of his job included approaching bars and convincing them to have a Harvey Wallbanger promotion where they would serve the drink that night at a discounted price, and then later on they would increase the price as it caught on. Once a bar committed, Wright would commit to being at that bar on the evening in question. He would bring free posters and coasters and towels for everyone who showed up. He would drum up contests in which women would feed men Harvey Wallbangers with a baby bottle, and the first one to finish won a prize. I don't have a picture of that, I'm sorry. That's right. Somebody's going to pick that up for next Tales. McKesson ran ads to encourage people to throw Wallbanger parties. Very detailed ads. Look at all that text. I'm explaining and that they would send them free of charge a drink recipe book, a food recipe book, in case you wanted to make any of the Harvey Wallbanger cakes and such.
With Galliano and everything.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And for little cost, T-shirts, bumper stickers, posters, etc. I'm guessing they ended up being free, not little cost. You could also mail away for Harvey Wallbanger party kits for $4. It was just like do-it-yourself party. And so they were really, this wasn't a organic craze. They were manufacturing these crazes. And people did do this. Well, here's another advertisement about how you can send away for the kids, various beach towels you can get. Here's a party, Harvey Wallbanger party. Now, I can't say for sure that this wasn't staged and that, you know, Tony Wright came up with this and cooked it up, or if it was a real party. But more parties, Wallbanger parties. So at some point, there were also like Wallbanger bowling teams, there were tennis groups. On anything that Wright heard of, he would send them free shit. In 1972, they ran Harvey Wallbanger for president, and there were pins and skimmers. They flew banners about Harvey Wallbanger over the Jersey Shore. At some point, Donato Antone, that bartender we mentioned, he was hired by McKesson to do promotional work for Galliano and to work on their new recipe book. He definitely did create their new recipe book in 1970. Both Wright and David Bednar were unclear when Antone came on board, though at some point Antone was pretty upfront that he was the creator of the Harvey Wallbanger. That is the back of his business card.
And the Italian Fascination.
And the Italian Fascination, which he alone has credit for and nobody else wants it. Nobody's fighting for the Italian Fascination. At some point, Donato and the McKesson was a victim of their own success. After a short while, other companies began to cut in on their business by marketing cut-rate imitation Galliano-like products. Basically anything that was yellow and sweet. You know, they'd bring into the bar, and if it was cheaper, bars would take it. This started giving Wallbanger a bad name, or a worse name. Bednar and Wright eventually left McKesson in 1973 to become beverage industry consultants. So that job is not new. All right. So now we're coming to this cocktail. This is the Seelbach cocktail. The Seelbach cocktail is named after the Seelbach Hotel, an old hotel in downtown Louisville that opened in 1905. In 1995, the hotel wasn't doing so hot. They hired a young man, or rather a young man named Adam Seeger, who was hired by the group that owned the Seelbach as their kind of director of restaurants and bars, was brought in and charged with improving the restaurant and the bar inside this hotel. It was his first job out of college. So first he went to work on the Oak Room, which was the restaurant inside there. He had good success with that. It got good write-ups. And from then on, he turned his attention to the old Seelbach bar. He started digging into the history of the bar. F. Scott Fitzgerald had stayed there, or at least drank there, when he was stationed while training for World War I. And there's a brief mention of the Seelbach, or a hotel that's supposed to be the Seelbach, in his novel, The Great Gatsby. So there was that, but there wasn't that much else. Seeger was convinced there had to have been a house cocktail. It made sense. It was, you know, a grand hotel of its time, and it had an ego about it, and you would expect that they would have a house cocktail that they would trumpet. Eventually, he called the Louisville Courier-Journal and told them he had found it. It was a drink that was made of bourbon, curacao, several dashes each of Angostura bitters and Peychaud's bitters, and topped with sparkling white wine. This is the story he told about its invention, which was pre-Prohibition. What happened was there was a couple who came in to the bar. They wanted drinks. The man was from New Orleans. The woman was from the East Coast. She ordered a glass of champagne, and he ordered a Manhattan. The bartender was a bumbling idiot, and while he was making these drinks, he spilled the champagne into the Manhattan. And then he set it aside, and then he made the drinks again properly. But later on, he returned to the mistaken drink, and he thought, well, there's something here. I'm going to work on this. And he worked on it until it was the way he liked it, called it the Seelbach cocktail, and started serving it at the hotel. And that might have been that, you know, a little local publicity. What's that going to hurt? But then there was a budding cocktail movement underway then in the late 90s. And at some point, a writer named Gary Regan, who used to be a bartender, came around. He was working on a new book called New Classic Cocktails. And he needed some new classic cocktails, but there weren't many to be found. He badgered Seeger for the recipe, and Seeger eventually relented. And the book came out in 2002. Well, that's Adam Seeger, by the way. I've seen him around. He's here somewhere. That's Gary Regan's book with the Seelbach cocktail and the history as Seeger told it. After that, it appeared in cocktail historian Ted Hayes' book, Seelbach Cocktail, also as a historical cocktail. After that, Seeger started seeing the Seelbach cocktail being made in London, being made in Berlin, being made everywhere. It was a famous cocktail. And then last fall, this article came out. That historic cocktail, turns out it's a fake. I wrote that article. What happened was this. Seeger had come to town to open a bar called the Tuck Room, which was attached to one of the iPic movie chains. And he invited me down to come and take a look. And I went down out of curiosity. I had nothing else to do that day. And I went to a very sparsely attended press event. I think I may have been the only reporter there. At the end of the event, you know, Adam Seeger made some remarks, and one of the remarks he made at the end was that he had made up the story of the Seelbach cocktail. And I just kind of like, you know, dropped everything, you know, that I was carrying. I kind of like rushed the stage after it was done. And I went to Adam and I said, what you said, you made up the cocktail, is that true? He said, yes. And he said, will you say that on the record? And he said, yes. I got the impression that he had been carrying this around for 20 years and he just wanted to be unburdened. This is the story, the real story of the Seelbach cocktail. He was a young man. He was trying to make a mark at the Seelbach. He was trying to keep his job. He thought there would be a classic cocktail, like an old recipe somewhere, but he couldn't find it. So he just made up the cocktail himself, and then he made up the story. He remembered a place in Chicago called La Paella that had great cava and Spanish brandy cocktails. So he started at that point. He changed it to, from brandy to bourbon. He used Old Forester because that was a brand that went back before Prohibition. It would make sense for the Seelbach. For the sparkling wine, he used Corbel because he surmised that that would have been more likely, I guess, before Prohibition in Louisville. And as far as the couple that visited, you know, that's just a whim, and that's just like a flight of fancy. And he introduced it onto the menu in '96. There was the local press, but then it started appearing in books, it started appearing in history books, and it, after that, it was kind of hard to come clean, so he just let it go. And so he sort of dealt with these twin frustrations for about 15 years. One, that he was actually, you know, telling a story to all these people in the industry that he liked and respected, and reporters too. And number two, perhaps more frustrating, he had actually created a famous original cocktail and he couldn't tell anyone. So I wrote it up in the Times. I think Seeger was perhaps surprised by the reaction. There was a big reaction, and the reaction was divided 50-50. There were those people who felt betrayed and angry and says, how dare you? And there were those who thought, awesome, you got away with that for 20 years. He wrote to me, he said, fun article, thanks. But I don't know how he feels about it today because I've talked to a lot of other reporters who have tried to contact him on this subject, and he will not write back. I think he's done.
He's done.
He's done with the Seelbach. But I think in the end, what we have is an even better story for the Seelbach cocktail. It has 2 chapters, so it's actually one of the most fun and crazy origin stories of them all. All right, so one last thing. My friend and colleague over here, one of his early books came out, what year is this, 2004?
2002.
2002, Esquire Drinks, when he had just been working for Esquire for about 3 years. And he did us a great service here. He compiled all these classic cocktails, but also some lost classic cocktails that we didn't even know about. You know, and we're used to this from him now, but this was early on, such as the Vera Rush. Here we have the Zambona Monkey Tail, Swinging Chad, and a couple others. So I'm going to leave it to David to tell us, how did you find those cocktails?
All right. They were all rectally sourced. But, so what happened was this. That's how it always begins like that, right?
The hoaxer lives on.
Yeah. There was no really such profession as cocktail writer in 1999, 2000. There were a couple people who were writing about cocktails, very few. There was the guy, the partners who'd been writing for Wired, Wired magazine, and they did very nice jobs of histories of cocktails. And I started, doing, Esquire was paying me to do a Drink of the Week column where I'd write up a new cocktail every week for their website. I was a junior professor. I could use the money. I had a small child at home, and I really hated my junior professor job. And I found this was kind of fun to do. And I really enjoyed researching cocktails. It was much more difficult then than it is now, although the books were cheaper. But I started ending up with like a lot of these things were getting written, and eventually, like I said, forgeries happen when there's a need, and a vacuum is perceived. One of the vacuums was pisco drinks. It's like there aren't that many pisco drinks that I could find, and I had a good one because a friend of mine was misdiagnosed, it turned out years later, with an allergy to grain. And so I was making drinks like pisco drinks and brandy drinks and things like that. And my friend's name was Mike Dulchin. He was a psychiatrist. And so suddenly there appears the Dulcin cocktail in Esquire. Subtle, potent, and delightfully mysterious. The Dulcin was created, we're not sure exactly when, for a scion of the New York hardware dynasty of that name who was allergic to grain distillates and tired of rum. Stump your friends. That was the little write-up. Now, I wasn't sure exactly when. Was it Thursday or was it Tuesday? Mike's dad did indeed own a hardware store, had owned a hardware store in New York, and he was tired of rum and allergic to grain distillates. So it was actually kind of true. It was just very misleading because it looked like an Art Deco drink, and I was perfectly fine to let that go again, let that go on. So that was okay. That's barely forgery. It gets worse. And partly this was also the beginning of the internet, and I wanted to see who was reading my stuff and where this stuff was going. And you'd see these drinks pop up here and there and here and there, and as time went on. So it was a good way of kind of charting if anybody was reading your stuff, because we didn't have comment sections or anything. Next problem. My wife had a drink that she really liked to order in dive bars. How do I get that in here? I could say my wife has a drink that she really likes to order in dive bars, or I could unleash some sort of ruminations about how hard it is to get a good drink and in a dive bar and what to do, and then add, you can cave and have a martini if that's an option. Sometimes it's not. Or you can fight the good fight, lecture and educate. Or if you'd rather not look like an asshole, you can have one of these simple charmers. Order it thus as silent film queen Vera Rush, and then in parentheses a couple of her movies, Intemperance and The Graven Image, used to order them. Myers on the rocks with a splash of pineapple juice. Because that was my wife Karen, whose nickname was Vera, because she liked old movies, and that's an old movie name. That was her drink. We met in punk clubs in Los Angeles in the mid-1980s. And she would go and get Myers on the rocks with a splash of pineapple juice. So I made up a couple old movie names, and the name for the actress, Vera Rush. Her name was Karen Rush, but Vera Rush. Intemperance, based on Intolerance, the famous silent movie. I just thought that was kind of funny and obvious. There's no movie Intemperance. The Graven Image, that just sounds like an old movie. I mean, that's as far as it went. Wouldn't you know it? Suddenly, silent film queen Vera Rush is being credited with this drink like here and there in Czechoslovakia and in South Africa and all over. And I was like, this is a little weird, Didn't people get that Intemperance joke? I guess not. Okay, moving ahead.
You will be tasting this if you're not tasting it now.
This
Swinging
is
Chad.
the Swinging Chad. Now, many of you are fortunately too young to remember the goddamn 2000 election, which was just absolutely awful, when they had to count paper punched ballots, punch cards in Florida, and the little things that get punched out are called chads, and they had to count, to sort them according to the voter's intent if the chad wasn't fully punched out. And there were swinging ones which were holding on by one corner, or hanging ones that were holding on by two corners, and so on and so forth. So I wrote up a column at the time. I wrote most of it on the Staten Island Ferry very quickly. One morning in the midst of the late spasm of electoral dysfunction, we received a communication from Hardwick, a young man employed in our research department. It seems that while spooling through the microfilmed morgue of the West Palm Beach Clarion-Shopper, he came across a curious item from way back in 1960. Okay, I thought that was kind of, you know, a fairly dead giveaway. The Clarion Shopper, that's ridiculous. Does research department for the Esquire, you know, drinks department? There's no research department. What are you thinking? Then I went through and it said what was in the article. It is to Mrs. Ivy Gelbfish, a 53-year-old Democratic precinct captain from Palm Beach Lakes, originally Bayonne, that we owe this little lubricant for the wheels of democracy. And then I gave a recipe. And the recipe was, I'd been reading Jeff's book, and he was talking about, I guess it was Sipping Safari. No, what was it? Yeah, it was Intoxico or the Grog Log. And Jeff Barry, who's sitting here, you know, Jeff mentioned that Don the Beachcomber's, one of his signatures in inventing drinks was a dash of Pernod and some Angostura bitters. So I took some gold rum, you know, Cuban style, a little splash of pineapple juice. There's the pineapple juice again. Angostura bitters, Pernod, and topped it off with ginger ale. Easy, simple. Cheers. But now it was a Swinging Chad from 1960 in Florida. Nobody was fooled by this at all. So I learned a lesson about forgery is you can be too obvious. And I was doing that, it turns out, as I discovered later, H.L. Mencken thing of using ridiculous names and all that pretty blatantly. So I learned my lesson. The Zamboanga monkey tail. Now, here's the little write-up that came with this drink. Finding ourselves one day in Oxnard, California, with a few minutes to kill, we wandered into the Salvation Army store. There, among the yellowing self-help books and coverless romance novels, we spied a battered copy of Trader Vic's 1946 book of food and drink. This fell out, written in a clear hand on the bottle-stained half of an airmail envelope.
What a chance.
And there's this, large jigger Jamaica rum, and then, you know, my interpretation in parentheses, say 2 ounces. You know, dry cherry brandy, and then I give, you know, how much Kirschwasser you should really make it, thus, you know, validating that the recipe is a real one because I've got to change it. And it goes on all down the line. You know, frappéed with mint and lime in the glass, et cetera, et cetera.
I like the sick.
Now, yeah, so it's all, this is, you know, exactly what you do if you find a handwritten old recipe. And I was showing my work, so clearly it had to be authentic. Except there is one thing. A famous old song that was very popular in the 30s, and it was a rowdy, drunk, somewhat filthy barroom song, was called, you know, Zamboanga is a city in the Philippines, and the song was, "The monkeys have no tails in Zamboanga." So, is there such a thing as a Zamboanga monkey tail? No. Now there is. So that was my clue, but it was a little too far researched, removed from help, and I kind of overdid it on this one. That one stuck around. And the drink was, a not quite as good version of a Mai Tai, but it was okay though, you know, and it sounded like a tiki drink. So as I said, Oxnard, a thirsty nation, salutes you. Finally, my masterpiece, so to speak, before I realized I got to knock this shit off. This was an actual recipe from the old Esquire Drinks book, a really fairly dull red wine and sparkling wine punch. Meh. So I was reading a book about the Garden of Allah, which was an apartment building in Hollywood, an apartment complex where everybody in Hollywood drank and partied in the 1930s. And the Garden of Allah was just fucking madness. And so I wrote a little story to go along with this. Fresh from a few months in New York, Robert Benchley, so the story goes, I wrote, is sitting by the pool at the old Garden of Allah up there on Sunset Boulevard, drinking gin and vermouth in just proportion with the usual crew. Humphrey Bogart, character actor Charlie Butterworth, George S. Kaufman, John McClane, the playboy/journalist who used to go out with Dorothy Parker, not the wise-ass cop from Die Hard. You know, you got to explain these things. A couple of starlets, including Natalie, Mrs. Thurston Howell Schaefer, and a screenwriter or two. At some point, Errol Flynn comes out of his bungalow, dives into the pool, and starts methodically doing laps. They make some wisecracks, which I will admit for the sake of brevity, ending up with, what is that stuff you're swimming in? Finally, Flynn takes the bait. All right, Benchley, you old soak, I'll tell you what. You swim across this pool once, just once, and I'll pay your bar tab for a month. Now, Robert Benchley was a humorist. He did some short films. He was a absolutely famous wit, but a real New York/Hollywood character that knew everybody. But okay, so there's Benchley, and he was famous for just this kind of situation. So Benchley says, "The pool, come on, Flynn, think big. How's this, old man? I'll bet you a straight $1,000 I can swim all the way to Catalina." Now, Benchley's a big man, but soft and paunchy, and nobody's any idea of an athlete. In other words, it's a bet. Everybody likes to take advantage of a drunk. In no time, they round up a couple cars, stir up some martinis for the road, and head down to the ocean. So there they are, standing around on a pier somewhere near Long Beach. Along the way, Flynn's picked up a cute little car hop. Somebody else has bought a case of beer. The martinis are long gone. Benchley takes his jacket off. "That's it, out there?" "That's right, 20 miles. You sure you want to go through with it?" Flynn, when a Benchley gives his word, he gives his bond. "But really, old shoe," says Flynn, "fun is fun. Let's just drop it." Meanwhile, everybody's exchanging private little glances behind Flynn's back. Without a word, Benchley strips down to boxers and undershirt and pitches himself right in. There's a mighty splash. He swims about 12 feet and then, convulsed in laughter, calls for a rope. Everybody's furious except for Bogart and Butterworth, who are cracking up. Bogey, you see, had quietly pulled everyone aside and convinced them that Benchley was a powerful swimmer. His New York doctors had made him start, you see, and he just took to it. And that paunch he was hiding under his shirt was, in fact, a cork life vest. So when Butterworth started making a little book on the proceedings, which just goes to show, I conclude, you can lead a drunk to water, but you can't make him think. We don't know if there's a word of truth in any of that, but if Benchley had made it all the way across the Gulf to Catalina, he would have drunk this drink. So anyway, ends. I thought that ended there, but it's now in a book of drink anecdotes from Hollywood, and now I'm screwed. Because I didn't mean it to go that far, you know. And this one got around, and it's because, you know, the whole idea with forgery is you put in the details that sound right, that everybody's going to know, and you don't worry about the other stuff. So I put in the cast of characters, and everybody knows that that's the kind of thing that happened in Hollywood. So, of course, this happened in Hollywood. So anyway, this is that was the end of my career as a drink forger. I knocked it off because I started working on Imbibe, which had to be serious, and I couldn't really go around faking serious cocktails like that, although you never know.
We're now going to have to comb over all your work and like check it out again.
Yeah,
it's all under, you know, the shade of suspicion.
These are the only ones I can remember. So
yeah. Well, we have time for a few questions. We don't promise we'll tell you the truth, but you can ask.
Is it true that speak of the Harvey Wallbanger, that to add a Spiced Galliano to any drink would have been referred to up against the wall. Maybe that has...
I haven't heard that. Have you heard that?
That was later, because it came from the Harvey Wallbanger. So slow, comfortable screw up against the wall.
Ah.
You're mixing the slow, comfortable screw and the Harvey Wallbanger. You're wallbangering it, in short. Yeah, so that's where that so it was the other way around, yeah.
Were you aware when you came up with the Zamboanga drink that there was a Zamboanga club in Hollywood and that the house drink there was the Tailless Monkey?
I was not aware that there was the Tailless Monkey at the Zamboanga Club.
I got very excited. He found it.
See, this is the trouble you caused.
I know.
You fooled a historian.
This is why I stopped doing this. Yeah. It seemed to check out, because, you know, I kept it small.
Anyone else? Back there.
Did Esquire fact checkers ever bother you about your fabrications?
I didn't have fact checkers for the online column. Eventually, I had an editor, and he was fine, but because it seemed plausible. But then, you know, for the stuff I wrote for the actual magazine, there was none of this in there. This was all for the online stuff, and maybe, you know, some of them made it into the Esquire Drinks book. But yeah.
I had heard, I always used to think that Benedictine was based on recipes that were found in an old Benedictine monastery. Is that all bullshit?
That's all bullshit. Yeah, Benedictine was not old monasteries. It was a marketing guy who wanted to start a liqueur brand in the mid-19th century and did very well with it and made a lot of money. But he had a chateau that was the original Benedictine chateau. It's all hoax. Yeah.
Over there.
Who's credited with the making the napkin recipe of the Singapore sling that is supposedly famously tongue?
Yeah, that would be Nyang Tong Boon. And you know, his family survives, and they were, you know, his great grandkids are around, and you know they say he must have invented the drink, but he died in 1915, and maybe it was earlier. It's possible because he was evidently a bartender in Asia, in various places in Asia, and made a bunch of money at it. Possibly invented it, but if he invented it, it probably wasn't at the Raffles, because it was a long time before he ended up there. But in general, it seems very unlikely. And the story they tell is bullshit. The rest of it. So that makes you quite, you know, you falsify one detail and all the other details are now suspect.
All right. Thanks for coming. Oh, wait. One
Yeah,
more
last
question.
one.
We got time for one more.
Sorry if you already addressed this, I was a little late because of the rain, but how much do you feel like this type of thing still happens now, given the
I think it's much.
media and the internet and all that stuff?
You got a lot of pesky characters like David and me now. I think it's really hard.
It's harder.
But at the same time, everyone let that Seelbach thing go. You know, just like the thing that surprised Adam Seeger the most is that all the people who wrote about it, nobody asked him to see the old document,
Yeah.
the old menu, the old recipe he had found. Not a single
See-
person. That would not happen today, I don't think.
I didn't write about that drink ever because I couldn't find any corroboration, and I didn't, you know, I had other things to worry about. So it was on my, you know, someday look into this one file, but I just couldn't. I looked into it very briefly and found nothing, so it kind of went onto the back burner forever.
I certainly hope there are other cases like that. It makes good
Oh, yeah.
copy. Anyway, thanks for coming.
Thank you so much.
Hope you had a good Tales.